Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host of this video, Reverend Jake Zabel, the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Now in today's video I want to talk about the topic of Kusters. What is a Kuster? So some people may have been watching my videos on lay reading or been watching my services online in which we've done confirmation and the appointing of Kusters in some of our mission congregations, and people may be wondering, what on earth is a Kuster? Well, essentially, when we in the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion use the term Kuster, we're using it the same way that it's being used in church groups like the Aldona or the New Confessional Lutheran Ministerium, which is the small group that split off from Aldona. So these three churches use the term Kuster in reference to lay readers. So essentially when we say Kuster, we mean lay reader. Now, historically though, Kusters have been much more than this. So if you just Google the term Kuster, Google will generally say it's a German term for the sexton. So think of, well, what's a sexton? Well, it's kind of like an all-rounder layperson. So the term Kuster, for example, if you look at the Church Order of Hoya, when it allows for lay reading, it says the Kuster should do this. But if you go to something like the General Saxon articles and it talks about somebody doing the lay reading, it says the Kirchner, or the church person should do this. So it uses a different word. So it shows that Kuster and the Kirchner are kind of synonymous terms, they're interchangeable. Essentially, historically, a Kuster was like everything. He was like the head layperson. He was the chairperson of the congregation, the treasurer. He dealt with the congregation's finances. He was the groundskeeper and took care of the property. He maybe sometimes looked after the Sunday school. Essentially, he was essentially the layperson that dealt with leading the congregation and was responsible for all those non-word and sacrament aspects of the church. Property, finances, keeping the congregation in order, church times, anything you want, as long as it wasn't the office of preaching the gospel and administering the sacraments. The Kuster was left in charge of it. So he's kind of a jack of all trades, an all-rounder layperson that just did everything that the pastor didn't do. And so in those congregations where there was no pastor, or pastor was sick, or pastor was on holidays, when the responsibility then fell to the Kuster to make sure people gathered together for worship. And here there would be singing of hymns, going through the recitation of Luther's Small Catechism, maybe some Bible reading, maybe some prayers. But here it was always meant to be seen as kind of a communal aspect. See, these days, lay readers have essentially become more like congregational lay worship leaders. So most lay reading services in churches like the Lutheran Church of Australia, the Missouri Synod, are essentially just service without communion. And so the lay person just gets up and essentially does what a pastor does. So in this sense, lay readers today are pretty much more like lay ministers. They're lay worship leaders. Whereas with the Kuster, in the historical practices of lay reading in the Lutheran Church, is that when there was no pastor, the worship was meant to be more communal, in which like the congregation would collectively pray together rather than having a pastor pray for them. They would collectively say the recitation of the Small Catechism. There might be someone that would read a Bible verse or ask the questions to prompt the congregation in the recitation. But this was more done as like, we just need someone to lead the community. In the same way that when you have like a choir singing, you might have a soloist that steps up to sing a few solo parts. Like he's still part of the choir, but just in order to lead the choir forward, he has to kind of do the call and response. So the Kuster lay reader did a much more of a leading the congregation in a communal aspect, leading him in a communal worship. See, when it comes to a pastor, The idea is that the pastor preaches to you, the pastor leads the worship, the pastor kind of does this work to the congregation, and the congregation then responds. The Kuster was more to do it with the congregation. So often the Kuster, when you do the recitation, the Kuster might say, well, what is the first commandment? But then he will join in with the rest of the congregation to actually give the answer. And this is because the Kuster was not meant to be seen as some kind of separate worship leader, but just merely a member of the congregation that stands in the front and helps lead them. It's like the idea of going, we don't have a leader here, it's just someone has to be first. First among equals, essentially. And so, yeah, that's kind of what a Kuster is. It's essentially a lay reader, at least that's how us in the coelc and also the guys in Eldona and the CLM use the term Kuster. But yeah, I mean, historically a Kuster was more than that, but we're generally just using the term in reference to a lay reader, although I like to use the term Kuster, one, because it is the historical German term for this office, but also because I want to try and make a distinction between what our lay readers do and what lay readers in, say, the Missouri Synod does. I wanted to make it clear that our Kusters are kind of leading communal worship rather than leading the worship and preaching and teaching the congregation. I don't want the Kuster to be seen as a lay minister, but merely as just the chief lay person. So I hope that answers the question as to what is a Kuster. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.